The Judean sun hung heavy over the gathered crowd as Jesus taught in the open air, his voice carrying across the assembly with an authority that drew people from villages and cities alike. It was a scene that had become familiar throughout the region in those extraordinary months of his public ministry. The teacher from Nazareth surrounded by common folk hungry for his words, while at the edges of the crowd, watching with careful eyes, stood the religious elite of Israel. Pharisees in their fringed robes, scribes with their scrolls, teachers of the law with their carefully cultivated reputations. They observed, they listened, and they waited for an opportunity to challenge this unconventional rabbi who spoke as if he had authority that superseded their own. The tension between Jesus and the religious establishment had been building for some time. He ate with sinners and tax collectors, touched lepers, and spoke to women in public, healed on the Sabbath, and forgave sins as if he had the right to do so. His interpretations of Torah often cut against the accumulated traditions of the elders, stripping away layers of legal elaboration to expose what he claimed was the original heart of God's commands. The common people loved him for it. Finally, someone who made the law feel like liberation rather than burden. But the experts in that law felt their authority eroding with every sermon he preached, every crowd he gathered, every miracle that authenticated his words with power they could not explain away. On this particular day, one of their number decided to act. The text identifies him simply as a lawyer, in Greek nomikos, an expert in the Torah, a man who had devoted his life to the study and interpretation of the sacred writings of Moses. This was no mere student asking sincere questions. This was a professional, a credentialed authority, a man whose entire identity was wrapped up in his mastery of the law and his ability to navigate its complexities. He had trained for years, perhaps decades, memorizing the commandments, debating their applications, building his reputation as one who understood what God required of his people. He stood up to put Jesus to the test. The Greek word translated test carries the connotation of examination, of probing for weakness, of seeking to expose inadequacy. This was not the honest inquiry of a seeker, but the calculated challenge of a rival. The lawyer wanted to demonstrate before the watching crowd that Jesus, for all his popularity, did not actually understand the law as well as a trained expert did. Perhaps he hoped to catch Jesus in a contradiction, to expose some flaw in his teaching that would diminish his credibility. Perhaps he simply wanted to reassert the authority of his own tradition against this upstart from Galilee, who presumed to teach without proper credentials. Whatever his precise motivation, his approach was adversarial, his question a trap dressed in the clothing of piety. "Teacher," he said, using the honorific title that was customary when addressing a rabbi, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" The question was fundamental, the most important question any human being could ask. What must I do to inherit eternal life? What is required to secure a place in the world to come, to stand approved before God on the day of judgment, to receive the blessing promised to the righteous? The lawyer knew, of course, what the traditional answers were. He had taught them himself countless times. But he wanted to see how Jesus would answer, wanted to find something in the response that could be challenged, disputed, used to undermine Jesus' authority. Jesus, however, refused to play the game on the lawyer's terms. Instead of offering a direct answer that could be parsed and criticized, he turned the question back on the questioner with a simplicity that was devastating in its implications. "What is written in the law?" he asked. "How do you read it?" The response was a classic rabbinic move, answering a question with a question, redirecting the inquiry back to the source that both parties acknowledged as authoritative. But it was also something more. Jesus was implying that the answer the lawyer sought was not hidden or mysterious, not locked away in esoteric interpretations accessible only to the elite. It was written plainly in the law that the lawyer claimed to have mastered. If he truly knew the scriptures as well as he professed, he should already know the answer to his own question. The lawyer responded without hesitation, quoting from the sacred texts he had memorized since childhood. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbour as yourself." The answer combined two passages, the Great Shema from Deuteronomy, which every faithful Jew recited twice daily, and a command from Leviticus that summarized one's obligations to fellow human beings. Love God completely. Love your neighbour as yourself. The lawyer had distilled the entire law into its essential components, identifying the twin pillars on which all other commandments rested. It was a brilliant summary, theologically precise, the kind of answer that would have earned high marks in any rabbinical academy. Jesus affirmed it immediately. "You have answered correctly," he said. "Do this and you will live." The exchange should have ended there. The lawyer had asked what he must do. Jesus had confirmed that he already knew the answer. Love God, love neighbour, do this, and live. The path to eternal life was not complicated, not buried under layers of legal technicality. It was simple, clear, accessible to anyone willing to walk it. The lawyer had won, in a sense. He had demonstrated his knowledge of the law, had received Jesus' endorsement of his summary, had shown the crowd that he understood what God required. But the lawyer was not satisfied. The text tells us why with painful precision, but he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbour?" Desiring to justify himself. The phrase reveals everything about the lawyer's heart and the trap he had inadvertently set for himself. He had asked about eternal life, had received an answer about love, and now found himself confronted with a standard he knew, in his secret heart, he had not met. Love your neighbour as yourself. The command was simple enough to state, but devastating in its implications. Had he loved his neighbour as himself? Had he treated others with the same care and concern he lavished on his own needs and desires? The command, once spoken aloud, became a mirror, and what the lawyer saw reflected back was not the righteous expert he presented to the world, but a man who had failed to love as he ought. And so he sought to justify himself, to narrow the definition of neighbour to a scope he could manage, to draw boundaries around the command that would allow him to claim compliance without actually changing his heart or behaviour. Who is my neighbour? The question sounded theological, academic, the kind of interpretive puzzle that lawyers love to debate. But beneath the intellectual veneer was a desperate attempt to escape the radical demand of love. The question was not original to this lawyer. Jewish teachers had debated the definition of neighbour for generations. Did it include only fellow Jews, or did it extend to proselytes, Gentiles who had converted to Judaism? What about the Amharetz, the common people of the land who did not observe the finer points of purity law? What about Samaritans, those despised half-breeds to the north who claimed the same patriarchs but worshipped on the wrong mountain? The boundaries of neighbour had been carefully negotiated over centuries of rabbinic discussion, and most of those boundaries served to limit obligation rather than expand it. If you could define neighbour narrowly enough, you could love your neighbour while ignoring vast swathes of humanity who fell outside the definition. Jesus saw through the self-justifying question to the heart that had asked it. The lawyer wanted a definition that would allow him to check a box: neighbour loved, obligation fulfilled, eternal life secured. He wanted to reduce the command to a manageable scope, to domesticate love into a duty that could be completed rather than a way of being that transformed everything. What Jesus gave him instead was a story. It would become the most famous parable ever told, a narrative so powerful that it would reshape the meaning of words themselves. Samaritan transformed from an epithet into a synonym for unexpected kindness. Neighbour expanded beyond any boundary the lawyer had ever imagined. The story would be retold for 2,000 years, illustrated in art, referenced in literature, invoked in ethical debates, preached from pulpits in every language on earth. It would name hospitals and charitable organizations, inspire legislation and social movements, challenge the comfortable and comfort the afflicted across countless generations. But before Jesus began, he let the question hang in the air for a moment. Who is my neighbour? As if inviting the lawyer and the listening crowd to consider their own answers. Who did they consider worthy of their love? Who had they excluded from the circle of obligation? Who had they passed by on the road because helping would have been inconvenient, costly, or socially awkward? The afternoon sun continued its descent toward the western hills. The crowd pressed in, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The lawyer stood waiting for an answer that would either vindicate his careful boundaries or shatter them entirely. And Jesus, the teacher from Nazareth who had authority that surpassed the scribes, began to speak. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. With those simple words, the parable began. a story about a road, a robbery, and a revolution in understanding what it means to be a neighbour. The lawyer had asked a question meant to test Jesus and limit his own obligations. He was about to receive an answer that would haunt him for the rest of his days, that would haunt everyone who heard it, that would haunt the entire world with its uncompromising vision of what love truly requires. The dangerous road awaited. A wounded man would soon lie bleeding in the dust, and the most unexpected neighbour in the history of Israel was about to make his appearance. But first, Jesus would show them everything that neighbourly love was not. The religious professionals who saw suffering and walked away, the keepers of the law who kept the letter while betraying the spirit, the experts in righteousness who proved themselves experts in avoidance. The story would wound before it healed, expose before it restored, strip away every pretense of self-justification before offering the path to genuine love. The crowd leaned in, the lawyer listened, and the parable that would change the world began to unfold. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Every person in Jesus' audience knew that road. They had walked it themselves, or knew someone who had, or had heard the stories that circulated about its dangers. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho was one of the most travelled routes in ancient Palestine, and one of the most feared. It descended from the holy city perched high in the Judean hills, dropping nearly 3,000 feet over the course of 17 miles, until it reached the ancient city of Jericho in the Jordan Valley, one of the lowest inhabited places on earth. The journey was more than a walk. It was a descent into another world, from the heights of worship and civilization into the wild and dangerous wilderness below. The road earned names that spoke to its reputation. Some called it the Way of Blood, a reference to the violence that so frequently marked its passage. Others called it the Red Road, or the Ascent of Adumim. The word Adumim itself possibly derived from a Hebrew root meaning red or blood-coloured, whether from the rusty hue of the surrounding rocks or from the blood that had been spilled there over centuries of ambush and attack. Roman soldiers patrolled it when they could, but the terrain made effective policing nearly impossible. The road was a gift to bandits and a nightmare for travellers. The landscape itself seemed designed for violence. Steep cliffs rose on either side, honeycombed with caves that provided perfect hiding places for thieves waiting to strike. The path wound through narrow ravines where a traveller could see no more than a few dozen yards ahead, blind to whatever danger might lurk around the next bend. Rocky outcroppings offered countless positions from which armed men could descend on unsuspecting victims before any cry for help could be heard. There were no villages along the way, no inns until the journey's end, no places of refuge where a traveller in distress could seek protection. Once you committed to the road, you were alone with whatever it held. Wise travellers made the journey in groups, finding safety in numbers, timing their departures to move with merchant caravans or bands of pilgrims. The foolish, or the desperate, or those whose circumstances left them no choice, travelled alone, walking quickly, eyes scanning the rocks above, ears straining for any sound that might signal danger. Some carried weapons, though a single traveller with a knife was little match for an organised band of robbers who knew the terrain and had chosen their ambush point with care. Many who entered that road never emerged from it, their bodies left for the vultures, their possessions divided among men who made their living by violence. Jesus offered no name for the man in his parable, a deliberate choice that made the traveller universal, every man, anyone who had ever found himself alone and vulnerable on a dangerous road. He might have been a merchant travelling to Jericho on business. He might have been a pilgrim returning home after worshipping at the temple in Jerusalem. He might have been a labourer seeking work, a visitor heading to see family, a wanderer with no particular destination. Jesus did not say whether he was rich or poor, young or old, Jew or Gentile. The audience was left to fill in the details from their own imagination, to see in this nameless figure anyone they knew, including themselves. The man was going down. The phrasing was geographically precise. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho was almost entirely downhill, a continuous descent that would have set a traveller's knees aching by journey's end. But there may have been a deeper resonance in the words as well. To go down from Jerusalem, the city of God, the location of the temple, the spiritual centre of the nation, was to leave sacred space and enter the wilderness, to move from the heights of holiness toward the depths of the world below. The man in the parable was descending in more ways than one, moving from safety into danger, from the presence of God into the territory where evil men did their work. He fell among robbers. The Greek word is lestai, a term that could refer to common bandits, but that carried overtones of organised violence, of men who operated in groups and made robbery their profession. These were not petty thieves snatching a purse and running. They were predators who stalked the roads and showed no mercy to their victims. The verb fell among suggests suddenness, surprise, the shock of an ambush sprung without warning. One moment the traveller was walking, perhaps lost in thought, perhaps nervous but hopeful that today would be one of the safe days. The next moment shapes were emerging from behind rocks, hands were seizing his arms, fists were crashing into his face. They stripped him. The robbers took everything, not just his money or valuables, but his clothing as well, leaving him naked and exposed on the roadside. In the ancient world, clothing was wealth. Garments represented significant investment and could be sold or traded. But stripping the victim served another purpose beyond simple theft. It was degradation, humiliation, the reduction of a human being to the most vulnerable state imaginable. The man who had walked the road as a person, with identity, dignity, the coverings that marked him as a member of civilized society, was now just flesh, indistinguishable from any other body lying in the dust. They beat him. The violence was not merely instrumental, not just enough force to accomplish the robbery. They beat him with the excessive cruelty that characterized men who had long since lost any sense of their victim's humanity. Perhaps they were angry that he had not carried more wealth. Perhaps violence had simply become habit, the natural expression of souls that had been twisted by their chosen way of life. Whatever the reason, they did not stop at taking what he had. They left him broken, bloody, his body a map of bruises and wounds, his consciousness fading as trauma overwhelmed his capacity to remain aware. They departed, leaving him half dead. Half dead. The phrase was precise and terrible. Not dead, not yet, not quite, but so close to death that from a distance one could not be certain which side of the line he occupied. His breathing was shallow, perhaps imperceptible to a casual observer. His body was still, the only movement the slow seeping of blood from his wounds. He lay where he had fallen, unable to move, unable to call for help, unable to do anything but wait. Wait for death to complete its work, or wait for help that might never come. The silence that settled over the scene was profound. The robbers' footsteps faded into the distance, their laughter perhaps echoing off the canyon walls as they divided their spoils and disappeared into their hiding places to wait for the next victim. The sounds of violence gave way to the sounds of the wilderness, the whisper of wind through dry brush, the distant cry of a bird circling overhead, the small noises of creatures going about their business, indifferent to the human tragedy that had just unfolded. The road stretched empty in both directions, 17 miles of desolation with a broken body marking its passage. From the wounded man's perspective, if he retained any perspective at all through the haze of pain and approaching unconsciousness, the world had contracted to a single overwhelming reality. He was alone, he was dying, and no one knew where he was. His family, if he had one, would not begin to worry for hours, perhaps days. His friends, if he had any, would have no way of knowing what had happened. He had become invisible, a victim whose suffering would go unwitnessed unless someone happened to travel that same road and find him before his wounds proved fatal. The sun continued its arc across the sky, indifferent to the drama below. Hours might pass, or only minutes. In trauma, time becomes elastic, stretching and compressing according to laws that have nothing to do with the movement of celestial bodies. Flies would begin to gather, drawn by the scent of blood. The heat would intensify as the day progressed, adding thirst to the list of assaults on a body already pushed past its limits. Each passing moment brought the man closer to the threshold beyond which no help could matter. And then, footsteps. The sound travelled along the road from the direction of Jerusalem, the soft percussion of sandals on stone, the rhythm of someone walking with purpose. Someone else was travelling the dangerous road. Someone else would pass this way and see what the robbers had done. Hope flickered in whatever part of the wounded man's consciousness still functioned, that instinctive response to the presence of another human being when one lies helpless and near death. A figure came into view around the bend, not robbers returning to finish the job, but a single traveller making his way down toward Jericho. As the figure drew closer, details became visible. His clothing marked him as someone of significance, someone who served in the temple, someone whose entire life was supposedly dedicated to the service of God and the care of God's people. A priest was coming down that road. The wounded man, if he could see at all through swollen eyes and the fog of trauma, would have felt a surge of relief at the sight. Here was help. Here was someone obligated by every tenet of his faith to show mercy, to care for the suffering, to embody the compassion of the God he served. The priest would stop. The priest would help. The priest would save his life. The footsteps drew closer. The priest's shadow fell across the road, and the wounded man waited, suspended between hope and despair, for the moment when mercy would arrive. But mercy, as Jesus' audience was about to learn, does not always come from expected sources, and sometimes those who should be most ready to help prove most willing to walk away. The priest saw him. This detail matters because Jesus was careful to include it. The text does not say that the priest failed to notice the wounded man, that he was lost in thought and walked past without awareness, that the body was hidden in shadows or obscured by roadside brush. The priest saw him, saw the crumpled form, the bloodstains darkening the dust, the stillness that spoke of violence and suffering. He saw, and for a moment his footsteps slowed as he processed what lay before him on the road. In Jesus' audience, the mention of a priest would have carried immediate weight. Priests were the spiritual aristocracy of Israel, descendants of Aaron set apart from birth for sacred service. They alone could offer sacrifices on the altar. They alone could enter the holy places of the temple. They alone could pronounce the blessings that invoked God's name over the people. When a priest walked through a village, people stepped aside with respect. When a priest spoke on matters of law, his interpretation carried authority. The priesthood represented the highest expression of religious devotion, the living link between ordinary Israelites and the God who dwelt in unapproachable holiness. And priests were explicitly commanded to show compassion. The Torah that governed their lives was filled with injunctions to care for the vulnerable, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the poor. "You shall love your neighbour as yourself" was not a suggestion but a command, part of the same law that defined priestly duties and regulated temple worship. The priest approaching the wounded man was not encountering an ambiguous situation that fell outside his moral framework. He was encountering a fellow human being in desperate need, and everything he had been taught from childhood should have compelled him to help. But the priest, when he saw him, passed by on the other side. The phrase "on the other side" suggests deliberate avoidance, a conscious choice to maximize distance from the wounded man. The priest did not simply continue walking on his original path, passing close enough that the victim might have reached out or spoken. He crossed the road, putting as much space as possible between himself and the suffering before him, as if the wounded man were a contamination to be avoided rather than a neighbour to be served. Why? What calculation ran through the priest's mind in those moments between seeing and passing? Jesus did not explain the priest's reasoning. The silence itself was damning, but his audience would have understood the possibilities, the excuses that might have presented themselves to a religious professional confronted with inconvenient suffering. There was, first and most obviously, the matter of ritual purity. The purity laws of ancient Israel were complex and demanding, especially for priests who served in the temple. Contact with a dead body rendered a person unclean for 7 days, requiring elaborate rituals of purification before one could again participate in sacred duties. A priest who touched a corpse, or even came too close to one, would be barred from the temple, unable to fulfill the functions for which his entire life had been preparation. The wounded man lying in the road appeared to be dead, or very nearly so. From a distance, the priest could not be certain whether the still form was a living person who needed help or a corpse that would contaminate anyone who approached. The calculation would have been swift and self-serving. If the man is dead, touching him will defile me. If he is alive but dies while I am helping him, the same result follows. The safe choice, the prudent choice, the choice that protects my ability to serve God in the temple, is to avoid the risk entirely. Let someone else, someone whose ritual status is less important, deal with this situation. I have sacred duties to fulfill. I cannot afford to be made unclean. The reasoning had a certain logic to it, a plausibility that might have satisfied a conscience looking for justification, but it inverted the very purpose of the purity laws it claimed to honour. Those laws existed to preserve the holiness of Israel's worship, to maintain the sacred distinction between the clean and the unclean that pointed toward God's own holiness. They were never meant to provide an excuse for abandoning the dying. They were never meant to make compassion optional. The priest had taken laws designed to honour God and used them to avoid loving his neighbour, precisely the kind of religious distortion that Jesus consistently condemned. There may have been other calculations as well, running beneath the surface of conscious thought. Fear, perhaps. Fear that the robbers might still be nearby, that stopping to help would make the priest himself a target, that the wounded man might be bait in a trap designed to lure compassionate travellers into ambush. The Jerusalem-Jericho road was notorious for such tactics, and the priest may have reasoned that his own life was too valuable to risk for a stranger who might already be beyond saving. Or perhaps it was simply inconvenience. The priest was travelling somewhere, presumably Jericho, where he had business to attend to, people to meet, responsibilities to fulfill. Stopping to help a badly wounded man would mean delay, hours, perhaps days, of caring for someone who might die anyway. It would mean expense, paying for medical treatment, for lodging, for whatever the man needed to survive. It would mean involvement, becoming entangled in someone else's tragedy, having to explain to the authorities what had happened, potentially becoming a witness in legal proceedings. The clean simplicity of the priest's journey would be hopelessly complicated by compassion. And so, he passed by on the other side. The footsteps that had carried hope now carried it away. The priest's robes, which should have signalled sanctuary, disappeared down the road toward Jericho. The wounded man, if he was conscious enough to register what had happened, watched his rescuer become his abandoner, watched the representative of God's mercy choose the other side of the road, watched the first chance of survival walk away without a backward glance. The cruelty of the priest's choice lay not in active malice, but in passive indifference. He did not harm the wounded man, he simply refused to help him. He did not wish him dead, he simply did not care enough to keep him alive. The priest maintained clean hands by keeping them at his sides, preserved his ritual purity by preserving his distance, kept himself unstained by the messiness of compassion, and in doing so, he violated the very law he claimed to serve. For the listening audience, especially the lawyer who had asked about eternal life, the priest's failure would have landed with uncomfortable force. Here was a man who knew the law, who taught the law, who built his entire identity on faithful observance of the law. And when the law demanded love of neighbour, when the neighbour lay bleeding in the road before him, the priest had chosen the letter over the spirit, the appearance of righteousness over its substance. He had kept himself technically clean while becoming morally contaminated by his own callousness. Jesus did not pause to condemn the priest. The story condemned him without comment. The simple narration of what he did and what he failed to do was indictment enough. The parable moved on, leaving the priest to continue his journey toward Jericho, his conscience perhaps troubled, but his schedule intact, his purity preserved at the cost of his humanity. The wounded man lay in the dust, hope fading with the sound of the priest's retreating footsteps. Time continued its slow passage. Blood continued its slow seeping. The sun climbed higher, bringing heat that would soon become dangerous to a body already weakened by trauma and blood loss. The threshold between life and death, between salvageable and lost, crept closer with each passing moment. But the road was not empty for long. Another sound began to register, more footsteps, another traveller approaching from the direction of Jerusalem. The wounded man, if any awareness remained to him, would have felt hope stir again, that stubborn flame that refuses to die even when reason counsels despair. Someone else was coming. Someone else would see. Someone else might stop. As the figure drew closer, details became visible through the wounded man's failing vision. This traveller too wore garments that marked him as a religious professional, not the vestments of a priest, but the clothing of one who served in the temple, who assisted with the sacred duties, who lived his life in the context of worship and law. A Levite was coming down that road. The Levites were the tribe set apart for service to God, the assistants to the priests, the guardians of the temple, the singers and gatekeepers and servants who kept the machinery of Israelite worship functioning. If anyone understood the demands of the law, if anyone had been shaped by the rhythms of religious devotion, if anyone should have embodied the compassion that the Torah commanded, it was a Levite. Here was a second chance for the wounded man, another religious professional, another opportunity for mercy, another possibility of survival. The Levite approached, the Levite drew near, and the wounded man waited, once again suspended between hope and despair, to learn whether this servant of God would prove more merciful than the last. The answer, as Jesus' audience was about to learn, would bring no comfort. The pattern of religious failure was about to repeat itself. The road of avoidance travelled twice before the true neighbour would finally appear. The Levite came to the place and saw him. Jesus added a detail here that he had not included in the priest's encounter. The Levite came to the place. The phrasing suggests proximity, closeness, a willingness to approach that the priest had not demonstrated. Where the priest had seen from a distance and immediately crossed to the other side, the Levite drew near enough to truly see what lay before him. The extent of the wounds, the severity of the beating, the desperate condition of the man in the road. He came to the place. He stood over the broken body. He looked. For Jesus' audience, this detail would have kindled fresh hope. Perhaps the Levite's closer inspection signalled a different intention than the priest's distant avoidance. Perhaps this second religious professional, having seen the wounded man more clearly, would respond with the compassion that his colleague had failed to show. Perhaps the pattern would break here, and mercy would finally arrive in the form of this temple servant who had bothered to come close and truly see. The Levites occupied a unique position in Israelite society. They were descendants of Levi, the third son of Jacob, set apart for sacred service after their ancestors had rallied to Moses during the golden calf incident at Sinai. Unlike the priests, who were specifically descended from Aaron and who alone could offer sacrifices, the Levites served in supporting roles, maintaining the temple grounds, assisting with the preparation of offerings, leading the musical worship, guarding the sacred precincts, teaching the law to the people. They were religious professionals in the truest sense, their entire lives organised around service to God and his house. A Levite travelling the road from Jerusalem to Jericho was likely returning from a rotation of temple service. The priests and Levites were organised into divisions that took turns serving at the temple, each division spending a week at a time performing the sacred duties before returning home to whatever village they inhabited. Jericho was a popular residential area for temple personnel, close enough to Jerusalem for convenient travel, low enough in elevation to enjoy a warmer climate than the holy city's heights. This Levite may have just completed his week of service, may have sung the psalms in the temple courts, may have assisted the priests with the offerings, may have stood in the presence of God in ways that ordinary Israelites could only imagine. And now, descending from that sacred service toward home, he encountered a man dying in the road. The text says he saw him, the same verb used for the priest, but preceded by that significant detail of coming to the place. The Levite's seeing was not a distant glance, but an up-close observation. He would have seen the wounds clearly, the lacerations from whatever weapons the robbers had used, the bruises spreading purple and black across exposed skin, the blood that had pooled beneath the body and dried into the dust. He would have seen the man's breathing, if any was visible, the shallow rise and fall of a chest fighting to continue its work. He would have known with certainty that the priest may have lacked, that this was not a corpse but a living human being in desperate need of help. What went through the Levite's mind as he stood there, looking down at the broken man before him? Jesus did not say, but the possibilities are painfully imaginable. Perhaps the same concerns about ritual purity that had motivated the priest's avoidance echoed in the Levite's thoughts. Levites too had purity obligations, though less stringent than those governing the priests. Contact with a corpse would defile him, requiring purification before he could again participate in temple service. And this man looked so close to death. What if he died while the Levite was trying to help him? Perhaps fear played a role. The Levite was standing in the very spot where the robbery had occurred, looking at the evidence of violence that might recur at any moment. The robbers could be watching from the caves above, waiting to see if this new traveller was foolish enough to stop, to become distracted, to make himself vulnerable. The wise course, the course that survival instinct urged, was to move quickly, to put distance between himself and this dangerous place, to reach Jericho and its relative safety as soon as possible. Perhaps calculation entered into it. The priest had already passed by, had already made the decision that helping was not worth the cost. If a priest, a man of higher religious standing with greater resources and authority, had determined that the situation did not warrant intervention, who was a mere Levite to second-guess that judgment? The precedent had been set. The path of avoidance had already been walked by someone whose religious credentials exceeded his own. The Levite could follow that path with the comfort of knowing he was not alone in his choice. Or perhaps, and this is the most damning possibility, the Levite simply did not want to be bothered. He had served his week at the temple. He was tired. He wanted to get home, to see his family, to rest from the demands of sacred service. The wounded man represented an interruption, a complication, a demand on time and energy and resources that the Levite had already depleted in service to God. Surely he had given enough already. Surely someone else could take responsibility for this stranger's crisis. Surely compassion did not require him to extend himself beyond what he had already extended in the temple. Whatever the reasoning, the result was the same. The Levite who had come to the place, who had looked closely at the wounded man, who had seen with his own eyes the desperate need before him, this Levite likewise passed by on the other side. The word likewise tied the Levite's failure to the priests, binding them together in shared culpability. Two religious professionals, two men whose lives were dedicated to the service of God, two opportunities for mercy to arrive from expected sources, and two failures, two choices to cross the road, two backs turned on suffering, two sets of footsteps walking away while a man lay dying. If the priest's passing had been disappointing, the Levite's was devastating. The Levite had come closer. He had seen more clearly. He had been given a better opportunity to recognize the humanity of the man before him, to feel the tug of compassion that proximity to suffering naturally evokes. And he had walked away anyway. His failure was not the failure of ignorance, but the failure of knowledge, not the failure of distance, but the failure of closeness. He had looked directly at the need and chosen to leave it unmet. For the wounded man, if consciousness still flickered within him, this second abandonment would have been worse than the first. Hope raised and dashed once is painful. Hope raised and dashed twice is crushing. The first traveller might have been an anomaly, a single hard-hearted individual whose behaviour was not representative. But two men of God passing by, two representatives of Israel's religious establishment choosing avoidance over compassion. The pattern was no longer an exception, but a rule. The religious system that should have produced mercy was producing only excuses. The law that commanded love of neighbour was being carried by men who did not love their neighbours. The Levite's footsteps faded down the road toward Jericho, joining the priest who had gone before him. The two of them would arrive in the city, perhaps within hours of each other, perhaps even exchanging greetings as fellow temple servants returning from their sacred duties. They would go to their homes, eat their meals, sleep in their beds, resume their ordinary lives. And somewhere behind them, on the road they had both travelled, a man they had both seen would continue his slow dying. The sun had climbed higher now. The day was growing hot, that oppressive heat of the Jordan Valley that turned the lowest road in Israel into a furnace during the warmer months. The wounded man's body, already weakened by blood loss, would be struggling now with dehydration as well. His wounds, untreated, would be attracting insects, beginning the process of infection that would kill him even if the initial trauma did not. Time was running out. Each passing hour narrowed the window within which rescue could still matter. The road stretched empty in both directions. No more footsteps sounded on the stones. The silence that had followed the robbery reasserted itself, broken only by the sounds of the wilderness, the buzz of flies, the cry of birds, the whisper of wind through the canyon. The priest and the Levite were gone. No one else was coming, or so it seemed. For Jesus' audience, the parable had reached its lowest point. Two chances for mercy had come and gone. Two religious professionals had failed the most basic test of their faith. The lawyer who had asked, "Who is my neighbour?" had now seen what neighbourly love looked like when it was absent. The cold calculation, the convenient avoidance, the prioritisation of self over suffering. If the story ended here, it would be a tragedy, a bitter commentary on the failure of religion to produce the compassion it preached. But Jesus was not finished. The parable had one more traveller to introduce, one more figure to send down that dangerous road. And this traveller would be different, not because he was more religious than the priest and Levite, not because he had greater knowledge of the law, not because his credentials were more impressive. He would be different because he belonged to a group that Jesus' audience despised, a people they considered enemies, a community they would never have expected to produce a hero. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho was about to witness something unprecedented. Compassion from a Samaritan. The wounded man lay in the dust, stripped of everything that identified him: his clothing, his possessions, the markers that would have told a passerby whether he was Jew or Gentile, friend or enemy, someone worthy of help or someone to be avoided. He was simply human now, simply suffering, simply in need. And the one who would finally see him as neighbour was the last person anyone in Jesus' audience would have chosen for the role. The pattern of religious failure was about to be broken, but the one who would break it would shatter every assumption the lawyer had brought to his self-justifying question. To understand the shock of what Jesus did next, one must understand the depth of hatred that existed between Jews and Samaritans in the first century. The animosity stretched back centuries, rooted in a history of religious schism and political betrayal that had hardened into something approaching tribal warfare. The Samaritans were descendants of the population that had remained in the northern kingdom after the Assyrian conquest in 722 BC, a population that had intermarried with foreign settlers, that had developed religious practices which differed from those of Jerusalem, that had eventually built their own temple on Mount Gerizim as a rival to Solomon's temple on Mount Zion. When the Jews returned from Babylonian exile and began rebuilding Jerusalem, the Samaritans had offered to help, and had been rejected as impure, as half-breeds, as people whose worship was tainted by centuries of compromise with paganism. The rejection had festered into open hostility. The Samaritans had allied with enemies of the Jews at various points in the subsequent centuries. They had desecrated the Jerusalem temple by scattering human bones in its courts during the night. The Jews, for their part, had destroyed the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim in 128 BC, an act of violence that the Samaritans had never forgotten or forgiven. By the time of Jesus, the two communities existed in a state of cold war, avoiding contact whenever possible, treating each other as ritually unclean, nursing grievances that had accumulated over generations. The contempt was mutual and visceral. Jews travelling between Galilee and Judea would often take the longer route through the Jordan Valley, rather than pass through Samaritan territory. Samaritans had been known to refuse hospitality to Jewish pilgrims heading to Jerusalem. The very word Samaritan had become an insult in Jewish usage. When Jesus' opponents wanted to discredit him, they accused him of being a Samaritan and having a demon, as if the two charges were roughly equivalent. In the social hierarchy of Jesus' world, Samaritans occupied a position below Gentiles in Jewish estimation, because at least Gentiles had never claimed to worship the God of Israel. Samaritans were heretics, apostates, the worst kind of enemies, those who claimed the same heritage but had perverted it beyond recognition. This was the figure Jesus chose to send down the road to Jericho. Not a Jewish layman who might show up the religious professionals, not a Gentile who might demonstrate that outsiders could be moral too. A Samaritan, the most offensive choice imaginable, the character guaranteed to make his Jewish audience squirm with discomfort, the hero they would never have chosen and could barely bring themselves to name. As Jesus spoke the word Samaritan, the lawyer and the crowd would have braced themselves for what they assumed was coming. In their mental framework, a Samaritan encountering a wounded Jew on a deserted road would have only a few options, all of them bad. He might pass by as the priest and Levite had done. No surprise there, since Samaritans had no reason to help Jews. He might rob the man again, taking whatever the first bandits had missed. He might even finish the job the robbers had started, adding murder to theft, taking advantage of the vulnerability of a hated enemy. Whatever a Samaritan did in this story, it would surely confirm the prejudices that Jesus' audience already held. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was. The Samaritan was travelling. He had business somewhere, perhaps in Jericho, perhaps beyond, the text does not say. He had his own schedule, his own concerns, his own life to live. Like the priest and the Levite before him, he was not looking for an opportunity to demonstrate compassion. He was simply moving through the world, going about his affairs, when the road brought him to a place he had not expected and a sight he had not anticipated. He came where he was, where the wounded man was, where the blood had soaked into the dust, where the evidence of violence marked the road. Like the priest, the Samaritan saw. Like the Levite, he came close enough to truly observe. But what happened next separated him from both of the religious professionals who had passed before. When he saw him, he had compassion. The Greek word is esplanchnister, a verb built from the noun for intestines, for the gut, for the deepest internal organs where the ancients believed emotions originated. It described not a mild sympathy or a passing concern, but a visceral response, a physical reaction that seized the whole body, a feeling so powerful that it demanded action. The Samaritan did not merely notice the wounded man, or feel a twinge of pity that he could then rationalize away. Something turned over inside him, his gut clenched with the recognition of suffering. Compassion rose up from the deepest part of his being and would not be denied. This was the turning point of the parable, the moment when everything changed, when the pattern of avoidance was finally broken, when love appeared on a road that had seen only its absence. The priest had seen and calculated. The Levite had seen and considered. The Samaritan saw and felt so deeply that calculation and consideration became irrelevant. Compassion bypassed the rational mind with its endless capacity for justification and seized control of his actions. He went to him. 3 simple words, but they contained a revolution. The priest had crossed to the other side of the road. The Levite had passed by on the other side. The Samaritan went to him, closed the distance, eliminated the space that self-protection demanded, placed himself in proximity to suffering without any of the calculations that had paralyzed the religious professionals. Whatever risks the priest and Levite had feared, defilement from a corpse, danger from lurking robbers, inconvenience to their schedules, the Samaritan faced the same risks. He went anyway. And then he knelt. Jesus did not use that specific word, but the actions he described required it. The Samaritan did not minister to the wounded man from a standing position, maintaining what distance he could while offering minimal aid. He got down in the dust beside him, putting himself at the level of the one who was suffering, entering into solidarity with the broken body before him. The Samaritan's fine robes, if he had them, would have been stained with dust and blood. His hands would have been covered with the evidence of violence. He made himself vulnerable, exposed, present in a way that required the abandonment of dignity and the embrace of another person's pain. He bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. The treatment was the best that ancient medicine could offer for traumatic injuries. Wine served as an antiseptic, its alcohol content capable of cleaning wounds and preventing infection. Oil served as a soothing agent, protecting damaged tissue and promoting healing. The Samaritan would have carried these supplies for his own use, provisions for his journey, resources meant to sustain him on the road. Now he poured them out on a stranger, using his own supplies to treat injuries that were not his concern, investing his personal resources in the survival of someone he had never met and would have been expected to hate. The binding of wounds required cloth, and cloth was not easily come by. Perhaps the Samaritan tore strips from his own garments, sacrificing pieces of his clothing to wrap the wounded man's injuries. Perhaps he carried extra fabric for just such purposes, the supplies of a prudent traveller who knew the dangers of the road and prepared accordingly. Either way, the binding was an act of sustained attention, not a quick gesture, but a careful process of wrapping each wound, applying pressure where needed, stabilizing what could be stabilized. It took time, it required patience, it demanded that the Samaritan remain in that dangerous place, vulnerable to the same robbers who had attacked this man, focused entirely on the slow work of saving a life. Then he set him on his own animal. The Samaritan had been riding, a donkey, most likely, the common transportation of travellers in that time and place. The wounded man could not walk. His injuries were too severe, his strength too depleted. So the Samaritan lifted him, an act of physical effort that would have strained muscles and tested resolve, and placed him on the animal that had been carrying the Samaritan himself. The Samaritan would walk now, leading the beast, moving slowly along the treacherous road so as not to jostle the wounded man too severely. His own comfort was sacrificed for the stranger's need. His own progress was slowed for the stranger's survival. The journey to the inn was the longest part of the rescue. The road to Jericho stretched ahead, miles of rocky terrain that had to be covered step by careful step. The sun beat down, the heat intensified. The Samaritan walked beside his animal, one hand perhaps steadying the wounded man, eyes watching for any sign that the injuries were worsening, mind calculating how much further until shelter could be reached. It was not a dramatic sprint to safety, but a slow, dusty, exhausting march. The kind of mercy that requires endurance, that cannot be accomplished in a moment of emotional impulse but must be sustained through hours of tedious effort. What did the Samaritan think about during that long walk? Did he consider the irony of his situation? A Samaritan rescuing someone who might well be a Jew, helping a member of the community that despised his people? Did he wonder whether the wounded man, once recovered, would even acknowledge what had been done for him, or whether ethnic hatred would reassert itself as soon as consciousness returned? Did he calculate the cost of his compassion, the supplies he had used, the time he had lost, the vulnerability he had accepted, and wonder whether it was worth it? Or did he simply walk, one foot in front of the other, focused on the task at hand, doing what needed to be done because it needed to be done? Perhaps compassion, once it has seized control of a person, does not leave room for such calculations. Perhaps the Samaritan had stopped thinking the moment he felt his gut turn over at the sight of the wounded man. Perhaps he was simply being carried along by a force stronger than his own will, the force of love, which does not count the cost, because counting the cost would be a kind of betrayal. The inn came into view at last, a place of shelter on the outskirts of Jericho, the kind of establishment that served travellers on this dangerous road, offering food and lodging and a measure of safety within walls that bandits could not easily breach. The Samaritan led his animal through the entrance, called for the innkeeper, and began the process of transferring his patient to proper care. He brought him to an inn and took care of him. Even at the inn, the Samaritan's work was not finished. He did not simply deposit the wounded man and leave, delegating all further responsibility to the innkeeper. He stayed. He watched through the evening and into the night, continuing the care he had begun on the road, ensuring that the wounds were properly tended, that fever did not develop, that the man he had rescued would survive the critical first hours after his ordeal. The Samaritan took care of him, personally attentively, as if this stranger were a member of his own family rather than a citizen of a hostile nation. The night passed in the modest shelter of a roadside inn, one man watching over another, compassion expressed not in dramatic gestures but in the quiet faithfulness of presence. The Samaritan could have justified leaving at any point. He had already done more than anyone could have expected. But he stayed, because compassion is not satisfied with partial measures, because love does not say enough while need remains, because the man who had felt his gut turn over at the sight of suffering could not simply walk away until that suffering had been addressed as fully as his resources allowed. Morning came, and with it, the next chapter in the cost of compassion. The Samaritan had to leave. His own journey demanded attention. His own responsibilities called him forward. But he would not leave without making provision. For the man he'd saved, the inn, the innkeeper, and the promise that would follow, these would demonstrate that true compassion does not end when the immediate crisis passes. The Samaritan had stopped, had knelt, had bound wounds and walked miles and watched through the night. Now he would show that neighbourly love extends even beyond presence, that it makes provision for what it cannot personally accomplish, that it invests in the future of those it has chosen to serve. The lawyer who had asked, "Who is my neighbour?" was about to learn that the answer had nothing to do with categories and everything to do with compassion. The morning light filtered through the small windows of the inn, illuminating the room where the wounded man lay sleeping, a fitful rest perhaps, interrupted by the pain of healing injuries, but rest nonetheless. He was alive. Through the night, the Samaritan had watched his breathing stabilize, had seen the bleeding slow and stop, had witnessed the first signs that the body was beginning the long process of recovery. What had seemed impossible on that roadside, survival, restoration, a future beyond the violence, now appeared within reach. The Samaritan rose from his vigil, muscles stiff from the long hours of watchfulness, mind already turning to the journey that still awaited him. He had his own destination, his own purposes, his own life that had been interrupted by this unexpected encounter on the Jericho road. He could not stay indefinitely. The wounded man would need days, perhaps weeks, to recover fully, time that the Samaritan did not have, commitments that he could not abandon entirely even for the sake of the stranger he had rescued. But leaving presented its own challenge. The wounded man was in no condition to care for himself. He had no money. The robbers had taken everything. He had no friends or family in this place who could take over his care. If the Samaritan simply walked away, the innkeeper would have no obligation to continue providing room and board for a penniless stranger. The rescue that had been accomplished with such effort could unravel in a matter of days. The man turned out into the street to face dangers he was not yet strong enough to survive. The Samaritan called for the innkeeper. The transaction that followed was remarkable in its simplicity and profound in its implications. The Samaritan reached into whatever purse or pouch he carried and withdrew 2 denarii, small silver coins, each one representing a day's wage for a common labourer. It was not a fortune, but it was not insignificant either. 2 denarii would cover room and board at a modest inn for approximately 2 weeks, perhaps longer if the innkeeper was not inclined to overcharge. It was enough to see the wounded man through the most critical period of his recovery, enough to ensure that he would have shelter and food and basic care until he could fend for himself. 2 denarii, the amount represented. Real sacrifice. The Samaritan was not a wealthy man dispensing charity from an inexhaustible supply. He was a traveller carrying provisions for his own journey, resources that he had planned to use for his own needs. Every coin he gave to the innkeeper was a coin he could not spend on himself, a subtraction from his own security, a transfer of value from his future to the wounded man's present. The cost of compassion was not abstract or theoretical. It was measured in silver, counted out into the innkeeper's waiting hand. "Take care of him," the Samaritan said, pressing the coins into the innkeeper's palm. The instruction was direct, clear, a delegation of responsibility backed by payment. The innkeeper was being hired, in effect, to continue the work that the Samaritan had begun, to provide the ongoing care that recovery would require, to serve as proxy for the compassion that circumstances would not allow the Samaritan to express in person. But the Samaritan did not stop there. He added a promise that elevated his generosity from significant to extraordinary. "Whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. Whatever more you spend." The phrase was an open-ended commitment, a blank check written against the Samaritan's own future resources. He had no way of knowing how long the wounded man's recovery would take, what complications might arise, what additional expenses might accumulate before healing was complete. Medical emergencies in the ancient world could be ruinously expensive. Special foods, medicines, extended care, the services of physicians if infections set in or wounds refused to heal. By promising to cover whatever more, the Samaritan was accepting unlimited liability for a stranger's well-being. "I will repay you when I come back." The promise contained another commitment. The Samaritan would return. His involvement with this wounded stranger was not a one-time encounter that would fade into memory as soon as he departed. He was binding himself to a future obligation, pledging to retrace his steps along this dangerous road, to check on the man he'd rescued, to settle whatever accounts had accumulated in his absence. The relationship that had begun with compassion on a roadside would continue, would involve ongoing responsibility, would require the Samaritan to remember and return when it would have been so much easier to forget. The innkeeper accepted the coins and the commission. Perhaps he was motivated by simple economics. Here was a paying customer, and the promise of more payment to come. Perhaps he was moved by the unusual nature of the arrangement. A Samaritan paying for the care of what was almost certainly a Jewish traveller, an act of cross-ethnic generosity that defied the normal patterns of his world. Whatever his motivation, he agreed to the terms. The wounded man would be cared for. The Samaritan's compassion would extend beyond his physical presence through the proxy of the innkeeper's attention, and, Then the Samaritan departed, continuing the journey that had been so dramatically interrupted by his encounter on the road. Jesus did not describe the Samaritan's departure, did not narrate the moment when he gathered his belongings, said farewell to the man he had saved, and walked out of the inn to resume his travels. But the audience could imagine it, the final glance back at the sleeping figure, the weight of responsibility that came with leaving someone you had fought to save, the strange mixture of satisfaction and anxiety that attends the completion of any act of mercy. The Samaritan had done what he could. Now he had to trust others to continue what he had begun. The full cost of the Samaritan's compassion, tallied up, was staggering in its scope. He had invested his time, hours spent on the roadside binding wounds, more hours walking slowly to Jericho, an entire night watching over a stranger in an inn. He had invested his resources, oil and wine poured out for treatment, cloth used for bandages, 2 denarii given to the innkeeper, an open-ended promise to cover additional expenses. He had invested his safety, stopping in a place where robbers had just attacked, making himself vulnerable to the same violence that had befallen the man he rescued. He had invested his comfort, giving up his animal to carry another, walking when he could have ridden, sleeping poorly or not at all as he kept vigil through the night. And he had invested himself, his attention, his care, his emotional energy, his willingness to see a stranger's suffering as his own concern. This was perhaps the costliest gift of all. The priest and Levite had protected themselves by maintaining distance, by refusing to let the wounded man become their problem. The Samaritan had done the opposite. He had allowed himself to be affected, to be moved, to be drawn into another person's crisis as if it were his own. He had let the walls come down, had permitted compassion to override self-protection, had accepted the burden that comes with truly seeing another human being's need. There is a kind of mercy that costs nothing, the sympathy extended from a safe distance, the concern expressed without action, the prayer offered without effort. It is easy to feel bad for those who suffer while doing nothing to alleviate their suffering. It is easy to shake one's head at tragedy while crossing to the other side of the road. The priest and the Levite may well have felt sorry for the wounded man even as they walked past him. Their hearts may have experienced a flutter of compassion that they then suppressed in the name of practicality, purity, or self-preservation. But feeling sorry changed nothing for the man in the road. Suppressed compassion is the same as no compassion at all, measured by its effect on those who suffer. The Samaritan's compassion was different. It was costly compassion, sacrificial mercy, love that expressed itself not in feelings but in actions, not in intentions, but in expenditures of time and treasure and self. He did not merely feel bad for the wounded man, he felt with him, entered into his suffering, took that suffering upon himself in a way that cost him something real. And in that costly compassion, he became what the priest and Levite, for all their religious credentials, had failed to be, a neighbour. The word neighbour had been the lawyer's question, the puzzle he had posed to justify himself. Who is my neighbour? He had wanted a definition, a boundary, a way of knowing who counted and who did not, who deserved his love and who could be safely ignored. The Samaritan never asked that question. He did not stop to determine whether the wounded man qualified for his assistance, did not investigate his ethnicity or religion, or social standing before deciding to help. He simply saw need and responded. The question of who counted as neighbour never arose, because for the Samaritan, everyone in need was neighbour enough. This was the revolution Jesus was accomplishing in his parable. The lawyer had asked, "Who is my neighbour?" A question about categories, about limits, about the boundaries of obligation. Jesus was answering with a story about someone who asked a different question entirely. Not, does this person qualify for my help? But, what does this person need, and can I provide it? The Samaritan did not define neighbours. He became one. He did not calculate the scope of his obligation. He simply responded to the suffering before him with everything he had to give. The inn stood quiet now, the Samaritan gone, the innkeeper going about his duties, the wounded man sleeping in the room where compassion had carried him. 2 denarii sat in the innkeeper's strongbox, earnest payment for care yet to be rendered. A promise hung in the air, "Whatever more you spend, I will repay." A commitment that bound the Samaritan to return, that extended his presence beyond his departure, that ensured the rescued man would not be abandoned even when his rescuer could no longer be physically present. Somewhere on the road, the Samaritan walked toward his destination, lighter in purse than he had been, slower in pace than he might have preferred, carrying with him the invisible weight of responsibility for a stranger he would never forget. He had become a neighbour to someone who would have been his enemy in any other circumstance. He had crossed barriers that centuries of hatred had erected. He had paid a price that no one had required of him, motivated by nothing but the visceral turning of his gut at the sight of another human being suffering. And in doing so, he had answered the lawyer's question more profoundly than any definition ever could. "Who is my neighbour?" The Samaritan had shown that this was the wrong question. The right question was different, simpler, more demanding. Am I willing to be a neighbour to whoever needs me, regardless of the cost? The parable was nearly complete. One more exchange remained, the moment when Jesus would turn back to the lawyer, ask his own question, and deliver the command that would echo through centuries of ethical reflection. The story of the Samaritan's compassion had been told. Now its meaning would be drawn out, its challenge issued, its invitation extended to everyone who had ears to hear. Go and do likewise, the words were coming, and the lawyer who had sought to justify himself would have to decide whether he was willing to pay the cost that true compassion required. The parable ended, and silence settled over the crowd. Jesus had spoken the story with a quiet authority that characterized all his teaching. No theatrical gestures, no raised voice demanding attention, just the steady unfolding of a narrative that had gripped his listeners from its first words. Now the Samaritan walked away down an imaginary road, the wounded man slept in an imaginary inn, and the audience stood suspended between the story and its meaning, waiting for the teacher to draw out the lesson that everyone could already feel pressing against their hearts. The lawyer stood where he had stood throughout the telling, his face a mask that perhaps concealed the turmoil within. He had asked his question, "Who is my neighbour?" expecting a definition he could debate, a boundary he could negotiate, an answer that would allow him to maintain his sense of righteousness while limiting the scope of his obligations. Instead, he had received a story that made definitions irrelevant, that dissolved boundaries rather than drawing them, that exposed the inadequacy of every attempt to reduce love to a manageable category. And now Jesus turned to him with a question of his own. Which of these three, do you think, proved to be a neighbour to the man who fell among the robbers? The question was devastating in its simplicity. Jesus was not asking the lawyer to identify who qualified as a neighbour, the question the lawyer had originally posed. He was asking which of the three travellers had acted like a neighbour, had embodied the love that the law commanded, had demonstrated through deeds what neighbourly obligation actually meant. The priest, the Levite, or the Samaritan, which one had fulfilled the command to love your neighbour as yourself? The answer was obvious. It had been obvious from the moment the Samaritan knelt in the dust and began binding wounds. There was no room for debate, no space for legal manoeuvring, no possibility of arguing that the priest or the Levite had actually been the better example of neighbourly love. The story had been constructed to leave only one possible conclusion, and the lawyer, for all his training in the art of argument, could not escape it. But notice what he said. The one who showed him mercy. He could not bring himself to say the word. The one who showed him mercy, not the Samaritan, but a circumlocution that avoided naming the hero of the story. The lawyer's prejudice ran so deep, his contempt for Samaritans was so ingrained, that even in the moment of acknowledging the parable's point, he could not force the hated word past his lips. He answered correctly, there was no other answer possible, but he answered in a way that revealed how far he still had to go, how deeply the barriers between peoples were entrenched in his heart, how difficult it would be for him to truly embrace the vision of neighbourly love that Jesus had just painted, the one who showed him mercy. Despite the evasion, the words were a confession. The lawyer was admitting that mercy was the essence of neighbourly love, that the one who showed mercy was the one who fulfilled the law, that all his careful definitions and categorical boundaries meant nothing compared to the simple act of compassion that the Samaritan had demonstrated. Mercy made neighbours. Mercy fulfilled the law. Mercy was the answer to the question he had asked, even though it was not the answer he had wanted. Jesus accepted the response without comment on its evasions. He did not rebuke the lawyer for refusing to say Samaritan, did not press him to examine his lingering prejudice, didn't lecture him on the inadequacy of his answer. Instead, he issued a command that contained everything the lawyer needed to hear, a directive so simple and so profound that it would echo through 2,000 years of moral reflection. Go and do likewise. 4 words. Go and do likewise. Not think about this. Not discuss this with your colleagues. Not incorporate this insight into your theological framework. Go and do. The command was active, urgent, immediate. It demanded not intellectual assent but behavioural change, not agreement with a principle but embodiment of that principle in concrete actions. The lawyer had asked what he must do to inherit eternal life. Jesus had shown him, through a story, what that doing looked like. Now there was nothing left but to go and do it. Likewise. The word tied the lawyer's future actions to the Samaritan's example. Whatever the Samaritan had done, stopping for a stranger, kneeling in the dust, binding wounds with his own supplies, carrying the wounded on his own animal, paying for extended care, promising to return, the lawyer was called to do likewise, not in the specific details necessarily, but in the spirit of costly compassion that had animated every action. The Samaritan had become the model, the pattern, the template for what neighbourly love actually looked like when it moved from theory to practice. For the lawyer, the command must have landed with the force of a verdict. He had come to test Jesus, to demonstrate his own expertise, to justify himself in the eyes of the watching crowd. Instead, he had been tested, had been shown the limits of his expertise, had been stripped of his justifications and left with nothing but a command that he would have to obey or reject. There was no middle ground anymore, no space for the comfortable, ambiguity in which he had lived. Go and do likewise. The choice was stark: become a neighbour or remain a hypocrite. We do not know what the lawyer did with the command. The Gospel of Luke does not follow him home, does not report whether he changed his life in response to Jesus' teaching, does not tell us if he ever knelt in the dust beside a wounded stranger and discovered what costly compassion actually felt like. The story ends with Jesus' words, leaving the lawyer's response, and ours, open, unfinished, waiting to be written in the choices we make when we encounter suffering on our own roads. But the parable itself continues to speak, its meaning unfolding in every generation, its challenge pressing upon every heart that hears it. For the story of the Good Samaritan is not merely a lesson about first-century Jewish-Samaritan relations, not simply an illustration of how religious professionals can fail while unlikely heroes succeed. It is a window into the nature of love itself, a revelation of what it means to be human in a world filled with wounded strangers, a call to become what we were always meant to be. What does the parable teach those who have ears to hear? It teaches, first, that love crosses boundaries. The Samaritan should have been the last person to help a wounded Jew, and that is precisely why Jesus chose him as the hero. Every barrier that human beings erect to separate themselves from one another, ethnic, religious, political, economic, social, is challenged by the Samaritan's compassion. He did not ask whether the wounded man deserved his help. He did not investigate whether helping might damage his reputation among his own people. He did not calculate whether the investment was worth the return. He simply saw a human being in need and responded as a human being. The boundaries that should have kept him on the other side of the road dissolved in the face of suffering, and love flowed across the gap that hatred had created. It teaches, second, that love sees the suffering. The priest saw the wounded man, the text is explicit about this, and he passed by on the other side. The Levite came to the place and saw him, then likewise passed by. Seeing, by itself, is not enough. One can see suffering without letting it penetrate the heart, without allowing it to make a claim on one's resources and attention. The Samaritan saw differently. He saw in a way that moved him, that turned his gut, that would not let him continue his journey as if nothing had happened. His seeing was not passive observation, but active perception, the kind of seeing that recognizes another person's pain as a summons to action. It teaches, third, that love is moved to compassion. The Greek word that described the Samaritan's response, esplanchnister, that visceral turning of the gut, points to something deeper than mere emotion. Compassion in the biblical sense is not a feeling that comes and goes, not a sentiment that can be enjoyed without consequence. It is a force that seizes a person and demands response, that will not be satisfied with sympathy alone, that insists on translating itself into action. The Samaritan was moved, literally moved, from the road to the wounded man's side, from indifference to engagement, from spectator to rescuer. Compassion was the engine that drove every subsequent action. It teaches, fourth, that love interrupts our plans. The Samaritan was travelling somewhere. He had business to attend to, a schedule to keep, a life that was proceeding according to its own logic until the wounded man appeared on the road. Everything that followed, the stopping, the kneeling, the binding of wounds, the slow walk to Jericho, the night vigil, the payment to the innkeeper, was an interruption of his intended journey, a disruption of his ordinary life, an imposition that he accepted without complaint, because love makes such demands. The priest and the Levite protected their plans by avoiding the wounded man. The Samaritan allowed his plans to be overturned by the claims of compassion. And in that allowing, he discovered a purpose greater than anything he had planned for himself, and it teaches finally that love costs something. The Samaritan did not love the wounded man with words only, with good wishes, with the intention to help if circumstances permitted. He loved him with oil and wine, with cloth and coins, with his own animal and his own feet, with his time and his safety and his future obligations. Every aspect of the Samaritan's assistance carried a price tag, and he paid it willingly, without calculation, because love that is not willing to sacrifice is not really love at all. The priest and the Levite kept their resources for themselves. The Samaritan gave his away, and in that giving he became the neighbour that the law commanded. The parable ends, but the invitation continues. Every day each of us travels roads where wounded strangers lie waiting. They may not be bleeding from physical assault. Their wounds may be invisible, internal, the damage done by poverty or loneliness or grief or despair. But they are there, on every road we travel, in every place we go. Human beings in need, suffering in ways that call out for response, waiting to see whether we will cross to the other side or kneel in the dust beside them. The lawyer's question, "Who is my neighbour?" still tempts us with its promise of manageable boundaries. We want to know who counts and who doesn't, who deserves our compassion and who can be safely ignored. We want definitions that protect us from the unlimited demands of love, categories that allow us to help some while passing by others. The question feels reasonable, responsible, the kind of question that mature adults should ask as they allocate their limited resources of time and energy and care. But Jesus' answer explodes all such calculations. The neighbour is not someone to be defined, but someone to be made. We do not find neighbours, we become them. Every encounter with suffering is an opportunity to cross the road or to kneel in the dust, to protect our plans or to interrupt them, to calculate the cost or to pay it willingly. And in those moments, we discover who we really are. Not in the labels we wear or the credentials we carry or the tribe to which we belong, but in the choices we make when no one is watching, when helping would cost us something, when the person in need is precisely the person we have been taught to ignore. The Samaritan still walks that road from Jerusalem to Jericho, still kneels in the dust beside the wounded, still pours out oil and wine on injuries that never seem to fully heal. He walks through every generation, in every land, wherever human beings choose compassion over calculation, mercy over maintenance of the status quo. He walks wherever the boundaries that divide us are crossed by love, wherever the suffering of strangers becomes the concern of neighbours, wherever the cost of compassion is paid without counting. And the invitation that Jesus issued to the lawyer 2,000 years ago still sounds in the ears of everyone who hears this story. Go and do likewise. Go, leave the comfort of spectating, the safety of distance, the protection of carefully maintained boundaries. Do, not merely feel, not merely intend, not merely wish, but act, give, sacrifice, serve. Likewise, in the pattern of the Samaritan, with the same disregard for social barriers, the same willingness to be interrupted, the same readiness to pay whatever the cost of compassion turns out to be. The road stretches before us, and wounded strangers wait. The question is not who qualifies as our neighbour. The question is whether we will become neighbours to whoever needs us, wherever we find them, whatever it might cost. The parable is finished, but the story it invites us to live is only beginning. Go and do likewise.